Hey, and welcome to Payments Cannot Fail by Form3. I'm your host, Mark Fieldhouse. And it's really exciting, actually, that we're joined today by our CTO and a great friend of mine, Ed. How are you, Ed?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thanks
Great
for
to be
joining.
here. Thanks, Mark.
We've got an incredible subject, and we heard from Mike in the inaugural podcast, actually, just talking about the company and how it's founded and some of the core principles that we're guided by. Today, it's one of my favorite subjects, actually, resilience at real-time scale, because as we often talk about in the office and to customers, what we do, we think is incredibly innovative and changes an industry and a landscape. So before we dive into too much, a lot of the world is evolving to instant and real-time payments. And there's no sort of overnight fix that's going to take people from one to the other. But when we look at resilience and how we scale platforms, just sort of rewind a little bit to some of Form3's history. How did they start, or how did you start, and what were some of the original design philosophies?
Well, there's one concept that some people might have heard of called Conway's Law. And that tells us that software will evolve to reflect the shape of an organization. So coming into Form3, we knew that we wanted our organization to be resilient in itself. So we set up our engineering teams to be separate units that could build software on their own and deliver into production at speed and at scale and sort of be independent of themselves. So resilient in a way.
That I hear referenced, or?
It could be, yeah. To support more of a distributed architecture or a distributed way of thinking. And that's kind of how we set up the engineering team from day one.
And when you look at those teams, and they're incredibly talented people, resilience is a word that it's banded around everywhere. And you hear about some of the fragility now in even some of the big hyperscalers that we've known to grow and trust.
Yeah.
When you talk about infrastructure, cloud systems, platforms, and they're generally all interchangeable terms, what does it actually mean to be resilient, either in a system or an infrastructure? Can you just help the audience understand what resilience means to us in the industry?
Sure. So I think if you take a step back on a day-to-day level, if we think about resilience, just things that you might interact with in your daily lives, like your fridge or your television or your car or the airplane that you travel in, these systems just work. They're sort of resilient intrinsically through all the great engineering that's happened over hundreds of years. And I think people just come to expect in modern life that things are resilient and they do just work. And I think if you look at then payments at a sort of a national level, that becomes even more important. But when you design a truly resilient system, it's not that it never fails. It's just you've thought about what will happen when it does fail, and that you want to avoid having a cascading failure. So I thought, the way I think of it is that resilience is really not optional, and it's that cascading part of resilience that you want to stop from happening.
Yeah, and I know obviously when we talk in the office, it's one of those core beliefs and core tenets that we have, which is it must be resilient. And I think in some of the other conversations we've had through this podcast, the one thing comes out a lot, of course, that although we sell and provide solutions to our customer, the eventual impact is that they're selling a service to their customers as well. So it's important that we build things from the ground up to be resilient. So outages are inevitable, right? Particularly in software, hardware, and infrastructure. They are going to happen. What do these moments teach us, and how at Form3 do we learn from those and account for them? Because as you said, you can't account for every eventuality. So when they happen, what do we do with those, and then how do we feed that back in?
Yes, I think that's one of the core things that you need to, and it's often a misconception, I think, that systems can never fail. And I think that's quite a dangerous thing to believe. That's the sort of hubris that does lead to, some of the classical disasters that we've seen in history, like the Hindenburg or the Titanic. And so we need to really just accept that there will be failure. And it's really providing that environment where it's safe the staff and the engineering teams to learn from that failure and not feel afraid to sort of come forward and say, oh, I think this is what went wrong at the time. And then if you embed that sort of psychological safety into your engineering culture, over the years, that will come together and will enable you to really build a very resilient system.
So what we're saying is, so issues will happen.
Yeah,
It's
definitely
inevitable. How you handle them is then one of the
it's key. And you've got to do a lot of practice. So it's something that you can't just expect to get right if you're not practicing it every week or even every night.
I guess it's like having a backup system that's not doing anything, and when you switch it on, it doesn't work and you're surprised. Yeah.
So you tend to find that teams or technology that doesn't have this culture, when they do have a problem, their time to recovery is typically very long and very noticeable. It could be, many hours. But teams that practice this and get it right, they might be doing it, every night automatically. They may have engineered a disaster recovery into an automated process and be running those test suites every night. So these systems resolve before the customer even notices.
But you still may not cover every scenario that could happen, of course. It's how you respond.
It's how you respond. You've got to remain calm. The teams need to know what's going to happen, who's going to turn up, how they're going to handle the situation.
I guess calmness is key, isn't it? Because if you have a team under duress or panic, they're not going to fix anything quickly, right? So
no, exactly that, yeah.
So when you look at resilience as a subject, we're probably going to come onto it during the conversation about how we observe and do our own resilience. But what does it mean for the wider payments world? So resilience in tech is one thing, but the title of the podcast obviously is Payments Cannot Fail. What does resilience mean for payments then in your mind?
So I think when you move to real time, you notice that payments are not something that is optional. So, if your favorite streamer's not working, you can choose not to watch that movie or to change to another channel. But I think it's a bit different with payments because they have real life consequences. Something that stuck out to me a couple of years ago is a bank had a payment outage, and a customer sort of posted on Twitter that they were abroad at the time, and they had to pay a medical bill, but they were unable to access their bank and do the transfer, so they couldn't get critical health care. So I think it just shows you that you have a moral obligation really to maintain your payments infrastructure, and that's really, we do really feel that at Form 3, that obligation there to make sure everything's up and running.
Yeah, and we throw a lot of words around, obviously, internally about trust, integrity. The platform is highly available, and our customers must trust us. I guess in payments, uptime is one thing, but I guess for our customers, serving their vast population of customers, it is about trust, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I think customers are not going to reward you for being up most of the time.
Yeah.
They're going to reward you if you're up all of the time.
And of course, if I'm making a payment and it's not available, then it's that one moment in time that I judge that service on.
And also, I'd say something that's also almost more critical is consistency. You need to make sure that you know that the payment's been made or it's not been made. If you're in a situation where you're making the payment twice, you'll lose that trust with the customer. Or left
guessing, or even worse,
Yeah.
And do you think engineers think about this differently to a bank? So our engineers, do they think about it differently to how a bank would think about resilience?
I think yes, I do think engineers are focusing on the technology and the architecture, so they're making sure that all components would have a hot standby or an active standby, and then they're looking at that very small component and building components together to larger failure domains and testing that each domain fails without impacting the payments. And I don't think that banks look at that quite in the same way. They're looking at the outcomes, the business outcomes, being available for their customers, making sure that performance is predictable and satisfactory. But I think the two trains of thought, they complement each other, and you arrive at the same point.
At the same destination, I guess. So when we think about, you and I have been in, or particularly me, we've been in technology a long, long time. So resilience isn't a new concept. People have always thought about backup systems and other things. It has meant that recovery almost hasn't been left as an option, though. It's got to mean that we're in real-time resilience, not a backup coming back in 4 hours or 6 hours with real-time payments. So when we think about recovering fast more than, or just don't go down at all, how do we view that in our platforms? Because it's not just, let's get systems back up and running in a few hours. It's just that they can't fail. So how do we change that mentality?
So what I've seen is a shift from, if we look at what is probably now labeled legacy technology, if you look at, let's say, databases is a good one to focus on. At the beginning of my career, sort of the best in class was an active passive model where you would be writing to a master node and maybe replicating to a standby node. Okay. And that was state of the art for a long time. However, that failure mode of switching from active to passive is always going to have a cutover time. And it could be 5 minutes. But in real-time payment system, 5 minutes could be impact 100,000 payments. So the shift, and where Form3 have also shifted, we started with actually a setup like that in the early days. But we've moved now to more replicated model where you have to pay a little bit of a performance penalty. You have to put data in 2 places or 3 places or even 5, 7. But for that small performance penalty, you get that reliability. You can cut over within a second, or actually 0 seconds. So there's no loss of availability.
So it's completely seamless.
It's completely seamless, and the performance penalty that is so small that in real-time payments, it's maybe 10 milliseconds or something, which is not going to materially impact the user experience. So that's a good trade-off. You've always got to trade something off. Yeah,
of course. So let me ask you a really challenging question. So is continuous availability realistic? Can we achieve that? It's continuously available.
I don't think you can, and that goes back to my earlier statement of a system not failing. You do need to expect it to fail at some point in time. However, you can certainly be aggressive in challenging yourselves to be available at, let's say, 4 nines. And it's definitely something that's achievable. In last year, we actually achieved 100% uptime, but the year before we achieved 4 nines. But in those moments where we were unavailable, it was just like clockwork. It was a practiced model where we went and recovered the system very quickly.
And I do think our customers expect that there will be moments of downtime or fragility. And I think what they look for is a partner that they trust and that they know implicitly has their back as a partner, and responds in those times in the best way that they can. But without naming names, can you think or describe a moment where you saw resilience really tested in the industry?
Yeah, I think in the last 2 years, particularly last year, there was a lot of challenging moments, especially with cloud computing. So the hyperscalers have the unenviable task of living in glass houses. Everyone can see their availability, and when they're unavailable, it's front page news. And there were a number of big outages from the likes of AWS and Google last year where they were down. But the big difference this year, or last year, sorry, is that they were down globally in some cases. So if your resilience strategy was, I'll fail over to another region, that was possible, but it has brought a little bit of doubt if that is going to give you the most uptime, because they could be unavailable in all the regions.
So you need to be much more widespread in terms of how you think about it.
Yes, so I think it was the year that multi-cloud, a lot of people appreciated its benefits last year, where they saw some of these more sort of global outages.
And with that global, let's call it global threat landscape, has it changed how you think about, or how your leaders and engineering teams think about resilience as well? I guess it must help to educate how we plan and build products in the future.
Yes, I think we do think about that. We also think about geography. So something that we've done in the US is we've adapted our multi-cloud model to suit the geography of the US, where they want wider distribution of resilience across East and West Coast. So that's been a great way that we've evolved our product in that space.
And was that due to what, latency, or due to how the US is set up differently to Europe? Or
yeah, there is a bit of both, really. I think customers wanted the ability to fail over from coast to coast. So the US perhaps has more challenges around natural disasters, and there's an expectation.
So an east-to-west balance.
That east-to-west is best of class. So yeah.
So I'm going to take you back on a bit of a history trip. So in the core tenets and the genesis of the company, we decided to build natively in the cloud and search for resilience and solutions for that. The cloud brings scale and flexibility and many other benefits, but we have seen outages in those hyperscalers. And as you said at the start, Ed, it's typically like your television or your cookie. You just expect these things to work. So it's often a little bit of a surprise. So how do you think those outages have helped to inform some of us and help being an enabler for resilience as well? And potentially, how do those vulnerabilities help us be stronger as well?
Yeah, I think certainly it's interesting to see these sort of systemic issues with resilience and perhaps an over-reliance on a particular vendor. One thing that surprised me when we had the US outage in October is that banks in the UK who were solely using UK clouds were also impacted by that. And it turns out that actually it was because they were using suppliers in their supply chain that, unbeknownst to them, were hosting in the US. So it shows you that you do have supply chain risk if you don't understand where all these different things are hosted, and one of those hosting environments goes down, there can be a problem.
So you could have this almost cascading level of impact, and it could be 7 layers deep that you don't even know. Wow.
Yeah, so nth party, it sounds quite a dull thing to look at, but it's really important. Nth party supply chain is something that you really need to understand.
And so do you think the industry has underestimated the risk, or still continues to underestimate it?
I mean, I see our customers and colleagues taking that risk very seriously, but I think perhaps they were surprised by what a real problem it is today. Yeah.
What about concentration risk in particular? You know, single companies, single regions, Do you think that's underestimated?
I think it's starting to be appreciated, especially with the problems we had.
I guess every outage makes people look up and think, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And do you think the cost of it? Do you think people look at resilience as almost like insurance? They only need it after an event, or they suddenly worry about it afterwards. Do you think it's becoming front and center now of people's planning and strategy?
I mean, it's certainly true that extra resilience does add cost, but I think if you've got the right, use case, you need to marry up the appropriateness of how resilient you need to be, and I think also you don't need to have the same level of resilience on everything. So perhaps your core payments flow does need 4 nines of resilience, but perhaps your name verification, that could only be 3 nines, and that might be sufficient because you could fall back to some other mechanism if that was not available.
So how do companies observe resilience? So it's not something that you can just bolt on afterwards, I guess. It's something that has to be thought about through a journey. So how do companies, or how do we particularly approach resilience?
Yes, as I mentioned, I think you need really to set up your engineering team from the ground with resilience as a part of your DNA, your core philosophy, and it needs to be built in as a feature from the beginning of the development cycle of a product. So you need to talk to your product people, decide on how resilient you want it to be. Can you afford it to be that resilient? Are you going to be able to sell it at that price point with that level of resilience? So you get all of that in the design of the product.
So it's kind of balancing everything.
Balancing it. But then if you've got the engineering talent and the right company culture that supports an environment that will produce ultimately resilient software. That's the key ingredient. It's about choosing fantastic engineers, having a safe place to experiment and learn, and then picking, appropriate technologies. And nowadays we're quite blessed with having a lot of great technology to choose from.
I mean, you've hit on culture a few times actually, and I think that's one of the things we do pride ourselves on with our engineers particularly, right? But what's the biggest misconception that you hear being discussed when it comes to resilience?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think if I was to put my thumb on it, I think in the past people thought that resilience was not really required, that people wouldn't actually value it and pay for it. But I think that is changing as we're seeing the benefits of, staying available for your customers, delivering their experience without interruption.
And I guess whether we like the outages or not, I think every time one happens, whichever vendor has it, I think it sort of focuses minds, doesn't it, that we have systems that aren't resilient or as resilient as we thought. Yeah. So payment volumes aren't ever going to go down, right? So if we bring resilience back to our industry now and payments, particularly with instant rails, those volumes are going to keep going up and up. Some say 20, 30% year on year. If you have to stress test, because really if you think about the volumes that come through our platform, how do you do that at scale? And you're running a platform as well. So how do you make sure it will scale for that?
Yes, you need to really build that into all parts of your development lifecycle or product lifecycle. So ideally, you want to be testing each feature for resilience and performance at scale. So that does require you to have, identical non-production environments where you can run these experiments at huge scale. And that's something that we've actually done from day one at Form3. Which seems obvious, but is actually quite rare. A lot of companies struggle to provide that level of replication. And you ideally want to release software in very small batches. So you don't want to have big bang releases where you've been working on a feature for months and months, because that carries with it risk. Sure. And also it tends to be a predictor for a longer recovery time if that change goes wrong, because there's so much in that change that it's very difficult to unwind it or to figure out what has gone wrong. So, a healthy team can be measured in sort of the size, the batch size, how frequently they're deploying to production.
Got it. Okay.
Those sorts of things, yeah.
And when you look at giving advice, I guess, for any banks, fintechs, or listeners to the podcast, what should they be thinking about or asking their infrastructure partners when it comes to resilience? Because sometimes we may just not know what to ask these partners. You reference those multi-layers of partners who use someone else's tech. What do you think are the most important things to ask?
I mean, I definitely think it's very important to understand that supply chain, because if you're going with a partner and let's say they're hosting on AWS, you want to know that, because then you can sort of model, okay, I want to model a AWS outage, what parts of my system are not going to work, and that might be fine.
So chaos testing type.
Yeah, chaos testing is another good thing. So I would work with my supplier to see how they test. Have they managed to automate their testing? So I think it's a potential red flag if they haven't automated failure testing. If they're just doing it once a year, on the day that they did that test that it's fine.
Work.
The day after, it's unclear whether or not that would. Yeah.
So I'm going to change tact a little bit now, Ed. So the UK and Europe, of course, we've had real-time payments for, is it 16 years, 17 years, something like that? Yeah,
something like that, yeah.
And the US are relatively late adopters to that. So we've got FedNow and we've got RTP from the clearinghouse. What are the most valuable lessons you think that could be passed to companies adopting real time? And obviously our platform now is fully available in the US. What sort of lessons have been learned, do you think, from UK and rest of the world when it comes to resilience?
I think one of the things I've observed is that real-time schemes have had a central bank mandate for adoption. The volume ramp up tends to be, a lot quicker in those markets. So I think, Brazil's a good example of a central bank mandate, and Pix has had, vast adoption really quickly. But they've also solved
Pix in Brazil.
Pix in Brazil, yeah. The customer experience with Pix is fantastic. They can do transactions at the point of sale, as well as account to account. So that has really driven the adoption in that market. In the US, I think it's been a bit slower, as there's no sort of central mandate from the Fed. But I think as those systems mature in the market, I'm sure we will see more banks adopting that. But I think it's really interesting in the US that they have got, they've taken resilience really to heart, because they have two incident schemes. So that's pretty much the ultimate redundancy that you
which
can
we
get
don't
there.
have, of course, in the UK.
No, exactly.
So I like to do this with everybody that I talk to. Let's go forward 5 years. What does resilience look like? Not just for Form3, but for the industry in general. And is there something or an element of that you think might surprise people?
I think resilience will manifest itself within engineering teams. I think automation will be commonplace. So it won't be perhaps a differentiator that it is at the moment. So I think we'll see most software teams automating all of their DR scenarios. But I think in the regulatory landscape, there'll be a lot more interest in the supply chain, in the concentration risk of the platforms that you're on, and what happens if they're not available.
And do you think I often think about the industry as a whole. Is there something that we still underestimate, do you think, with resilience? One or two big things that we're just not thinking about clearly enough?
I do think that, like going back to what I spoke about earlier, I think adding resilience after you've designed the product is perhaps something that a lot of people miss. It really does need to go in at the beginning as a key requirement for that. And I think in the future it'll be interesting to see how AI can support software teams run complex distributed systems, and how AI could potentially help reduce recovery time, or even better prevent incidents by having a feed of all of the observability that's going on in the platform and making suggestions to the engineering teams.
It's almost like additional people in your team that are keeping a watchful
giving
eye.
you like preventative advice of what to do.
Ed, look, I could talk about this for hours. I know we often do on trips together as well. I cannot thank you enough. It's been incredible to listen to how you and your engineering teams at Form3 and the industry think about and handle resiliency. So personally and on behalf of the listeners, thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.